Do you remember that Coleco Telstar? Once in every home. Suddenly, it failed miserably in the 1970s. This era quietly became a graveyard for innovation. Even giants like Sony Betamax couldn't survive the carnage. How can something so widely used fail at that scale? Let's discover. Betamax wasn't just a video recorder. It was Sony's declaration of war against forgetting. For the first time, you didn't have to schedule your life around TV programs. You controlled when memories happened. The machine was beautiful, heavy, solid, with mechanical clicks that sounded. When you slid a tape in, it felt important. Picture quality was sharper than anything on the market. Colors didn't bleed, lines stayed crisp. Sony had built something technically superior, but Betamax tapes could only record 1 hour. VHS offered 2, then 4, then 6. The $2,295 price tag, nearly $13,000 today, made it a luxury. Early adopters became evangelists, defending their choice, insisting picture quality mattered more. They were technically right. But video stores stocked VHS. Friends traded VHS tapes. By the mid-1980s, Betamax was a punchline. Sony kept fighting for 3 decades before finally admitting defeat in 2002. Polavision promised instant movies, not photos, actual moving pictures you could watch minutes after filming. Polaroid spent decades developing this system, pouring $68.5 million into bringing home cinema to the masses. The camera was sleek, the technology revolutionary. You filmed on special cartridges, popped them into a viewer, and watched your life play back immediately. No developing labs, no waiting, pure, instant gratification. But the system had fatal flaws. Each cartridge held only 2.5 minutes of silent, murky footage. No sound, no editing, no way to show it on a TV. The viewer was bulky, expensive, and the film quality looked washed out and dark. While Polavision was being developed, VHS and Betamax emerged, offering hours of recordable, reusable, sound-enabled footage. By 1979, Polaroid discontinued Polavision, selling off equipment at devastating losses. The instant movie dream died before it ever truly lived. AT&T believed the future of communication was seeing the person you talked to. The picture phone debuted at the 1964 World's Fair, then launched commercially in 1970 in Pittsburgh and Chicago. It was futuristic. A small screen, a camera, push-button controls, and surprisingly clear video quality for its time. Users could even control whether video was transmitted. The technology worked, but the cost was astronomical. Installation ran $160, plus $75 monthly for a single unit. A 3-minute call between cities cost $27, over $200 in today's money. The service required special dedicated lines AT&T had to install. Businesses didn't see the value. Consumers couldn't afford it. People felt uncomfortable being on camera during calls. They didn't want to dress up or worry about their appearance just to talk. By 1973, fewer than 500 units were in use. AT&T quietly shut down the service, writing off millions in investment. RCA spent 17 years developing the capacitance electronic disc system. 17 years? It wasn't a laser. It was a vinyl-like disc read by a stylus, just like a record player. But for video, the discs were massive, housed in protective caddies, and could hold 2 hours of video. RCA promised it would be cheaper than VHS and Betamax, the affordable alternative for home video that would finally win the format war. When it finally launched in 1981, the technology was already obsolete. The discs wore out after a few dozen plays. They skipped like bad records. They scratched easily, rendering movies unwatchable. You couldn't record on them, only play pre-recorded movies. No time shifting, no home videos. Meanwhile, VCRs let you record, rewind, pause, fast forward, and reuse tapes endlessly. CED players were clunky and broke constantly. The stylus mechanism was fragile and temperamental, requiring frequent replacement. Movie studios barely supported the format, releasing only limited titles. RCA lost over $580 million before killing the system in 1984, just 3 years after launch. All that development, all those years, all that money, gone. The format war was over before CED even entered the ring. RCA had bet the company's future on obsolete technology, stubbornly refusing to admit videotape had already won. The 8-track tape was supposed to revolutionize mobile music. For a moment in the early 1970s, it actually did. Cars came with 8-track players built directly into dashboards as standard equipment. You could listen to full albums without flipping anything, without stopping, without interruption. The technology was elegantly simple, an endless loop of tape divided into 8 parallel tracks. Push a button, and the player switched tracks automatically. It seemed perfect for the car culture dominating American life, but simplicity became its curse. The tape format made it impossible to rewind. If you missed a song or wanted to replay something, you had to wait for the entire loop to cycle back, sometimes 20 minutes or more. Tapes jammed constantly as the endless loop mechanism tangled and twisted. The loop mechanism broke frequently, requiring expensive repairs. Sound quality degraded fast as the tape rubbed against itself continuously, wearing out rapidly. Wow and flutter were constant problems. Worse, the format forced albums to be split awkwardly across the 8 tracks. Songs were cut mid-verse, sometimes mid-word, to fit track divisions. You'd be listening to a song, and suddenly it would fade out, switch tracks with a loud click, then fade back in. It destroyed the artistic integrity of albums and infuriated music fans. When cassette tapes emerged with rewind capability, smaller size, better durability, and no track-switching interruptions, 8-track couldn't compete on any level. By 1982, most manufacturers stopped production entirely. Millions of players and tapes became worthless overnight, filling landfills and thrift stores. Up to now, we've seen format wars and catastrophic timing. Betamax lost, despite being better. Polavision arrived obsolete. A picture phone cost a fortune. RCA spent 17 years building failure. 8 tracks collapsed instantly, but what's coming next is worse. Technologies so confusing they destroyed entire markets. Quadraphonic sound promised to surround you with music. 4 speakers, 4 channels, total immersion. Audio companies spent millions convincing consumers that stereo was obsolete, outdated technology from a simpler era. The experience was genuinely impressive when it worked properly. Sound moved around the room, instruments positioned in 3-dimensional space, creating depth and immersion. Stereo couldn't touch. Demonstrations in audio showrooms left listeners amazed, but the format was doomed by catastrophic confusion. There were multiple incompatible quadraphonic formats: SQ, QS, CD4, discrete quad. None worked with each other. Consumers walked into stores overwhelmed and bewildered. Which system should they buy? Would their records work? Salespeople couldn't explain the differences. Record labels didn't know which format to support, so they hedged by releasing albums in multiple formats or none at all. Equipment was expensive. 4 speakers, special quad receivers, amplifiers with 4 channels, specialized turntable cartridges for CD4. The music selection was severely limited. Most quadraphonic albums were simply stereo mixes artificially processed for 4 channels using primitive algorithms. Audiophiles could immediately hear the difference, and they hated it. The sound was phasey, unnatural, hollow. Genuine discrete quad recordings were rare. Record stores carried quadraphonic sections that nobody browsed. Sales were dismal. By the late 1970s, manufacturers quietly abandoned the technology, writing off millions in development and marketing. Surround sound would return decades later with home theater systems, but quadrophonic's failure taught the industry brutal lessons about format wars and consumer confusion. When competing incompatible standards confuse the market, everybody loses. Laserdisc was the future, just 20 years too early. Released in 1978 as DiscoVision, the format used lasers to read video from massive 12-inch discs. Picture quality was spectacular, far better than VHS or Betamax. Film enthusiasts were genuinely stunned by the clarity, detail, and color accuracy. The discs didn't degrade with repeated plays like magnetic tape. They offered special features, director's commentary, multiple audio tracks, and chapter selection. Concepts that wouldn't become standard until DVDs emerged 2 decades later. But Laserdisc had critical, fatal flaws. The discs were enormous and fragile, the size of vinyl LPs, prone to warping and scratching. Players cost $700 to $1,000, prohibitively expensive when VCRs cost half as much. Individual movie discs cost $25 to $50 each, while VHS rentals cost $3. You couldn't record on Laserdisc, eliminating the time-shifting capability that made VCRs essential. Most frustratingly, movies longer than 2 hours required flipping the disc halfway through, interrupting the viewing experience at the worst moments. Early discs suffered from laser rot, a chemical deterioration where the aluminum layer oxidized, causing permanent damage despite manufacturer promises of permanence. Rental stores didn't stock Laserdisc because the format had no rental market. Coleco bet everything on Pong. The Telstar was a home console that played variations of the simple ball and paddle game that dominated arcades. Released in 1976 for just $50, it was affordable and accessible to middle-class families. Coleco sold over 1 million units in the first year. Success seemed guaranteed, inevitable even. The company flooded the market with Telstar variants, Telstar Arcade, Telstar Ranger, Telstar Gemini, Telstar Colormatic. 14 different models, each with slight variations, each promising something new. But everyone else had the same idea. By 1977, over 24 companies were selling Pong clones. Sears, Atari, Magnavox, and countless no-name manufacturers. The market was catastrophically oversaturated. Prices crashed as companies desperately tried to move inventory. Store shelves overflowed with unsold consoles. Retailers slashed prices to clear space. Consumers stopped buying entirely, confused by too many identical products. Then Atari released the VCS with interchangeable cartridges, making dedicated Pong consoles instantly, completely obsolete. Why buy a machine that plays one game when you could buy a system that plays dozens? The Pong console market collapsed overnight. Coleco lost $22 million in a single year, a staggering loss that nearly destroyed the company. Warehouses full of Telstar consoles were sold for pennies on the dollar or simply destroyed. The video game crash of 1977 killed dozens of companies. Coleco survived, but barely, limping forward until they could reinvent themselves with the ColecoVision years later. The Fairchild Channel F was genuinely revolutionary. Released in 1976, it was the first home console to use ROM cartridges and a microprocessor, before Atari's VCS, before everything. Engineer Jerry Lawson, a pioneering black engineer, invented interchangeable game technology that would define the video game industry for decades. The console itself was sturdy, well-designed, with built-in controllers that twisted and pushed for different actions, and a library of games, including tennis and hockey, preloaded into the system. But being first doesn't guarantee success. The Channel F had severely limited color palettes, mostly orange, green, blue, and white. Gameplay was slow, sluggish, and visually unimpressive. The games were educational and intellectual. Math puzzles, strategy games, simple sports simulations, titles that couldn't compete with the action-driven arcade ports consumers craved. The graphics were blocky, even by 1976 standards. Game cartridges were expensive and rarely appeared in stores. When the Atari VCS launched a year later in 1977 with superior graphics, faster processors, third-party developer support, and arcade-perfect ports of games like Space Invaders and Pac-Man, the Channel F was instantly buried. Atari had marketing muscle, retail presence, and games people actually wanted to play. Fairchild couldn't compete on any level. Fairchild sold the console division to Zircon in 1979, and production quietly ended shortly after. Texas Instruments believed home computers were the next frontier. The TI-99-4 launched in 1979 as the world's first 16-bit home computer, a genuine technological achievement that should have dominated the emerging market. TI was a serious, respected company. They made calculators, semiconductor chips, and sophisticated military equipment. This wasn't a toy from some startup. The computer boasted impressive technical specifications and a futuristic silver design that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. But TI made catastrophic decisions that doomed the product. The chiclet keyboard was nearly unusable. Keys were tiny, mushy, unresponsive, and frustrating. Typing anything substantial was torture. The machine couldn't display lowercase letters, only uppercase, making text look like shouting. You couldn't boot software from ROM cartridges, severely limiting expandability. The architecture was closed and proprietary, discouraging third-party development. At $150, over $5,000 in today's money, it was absurdly, prohibitively expensive when competitors cost half as much. Only 20,000 units sold before TI pulled it from shelves in embarrassment. They redesigned it as the TI-99-4A with a better keyboard and lowercase capability, which found moderate success. Citizens band radio exploded in the mid-1970s like nothing before it. Truckers used CB radios to communicate on highways, warning each other about speed traps and road conditions. Then the 1973 oil crisis imposed a national 55 mph speed limit, and CB culture became a nationwide phenomenon. Suddenly, everyone wanted a CB radio. Movies like Smokey and the Bandit and songs like Convoy made CB radios cool, aspirational, part of American culture. Manufacturers couldn't produce units fast enough to meet demand. By 1977, over 20 million CB radios were in use. Retailers sold CB radios, antennas, linear amplifiers, and accessories at astronomical markups. People spoke in CB slang. Breaker, breaker, 10-4 good buddy, what's your 20, got your ears on? It felt like the future of communication, democratized radio for everyone. Then it collapsed catastrophically. The airwaves became impossibly crowded, channels were chaos, people yelling over each other, interference, profanity, harassment. The FCC couldn't enforce regulations. Clive Sinclair wanted to put a calculator in every pocket. The Sinclair Executive, released in 1972, was the world's first truly slim pocket calculator. At just half an inch thick, it was a genuine marvel of miniaturization, a breakthrough in consumer electronics. Previous calculators were bulky, desk-bound machines weighing pounds. Sinclair's vision was radical. A calculator you could slip into a shirt pocket and carry anywhere, making mathematical computation genuinely portable. The device was elegant, futuristic, and genuinely innovative with its sleek black design and distinctive styling. It cost $79, expensive but attainable for professionals, engineers, and business people. For a moment, Sinclair looked like a genius who'd revolutionized personal computing, but the executive had devastating flaws that revealed themselves immediately. The battery life was atrocious, sometimes less than an hour of continuous use. The LED display drained power so ferociously that users constantly needed new batteries. Batteries were expensive and hard to find in the specific sizes required. The calculator's membrane switches were unreliable, failing after minimal use, becoming unresponsive or sticking. The LED display was difficult to read in bright light, washing out completely in sunlight. Worst of all, the circuitry was fragile and prone to failure. Units failed constantly with mysterious problems, displays dying, calculations producing wrong answers, switches stopping working entirely. Returns flooded Sinclair's tiny repair operation, completely overwhelming the company's capacity. Sinclair spent more money on warranty repairs than on actual sales. The repair backlog stretched for months. Customer satisfaction plummeted. Meanwhile, competitors like Texas Instruments and Hewlett-Packard released LCD calculators with vastly superior battery life, lasting weeks or months instead of hours, and lower prices. Sinclair's dream of pocket computing was correct. He was just too early. Cartravision was supposed to conquer home entertainment. Released in 1972, it was the first consumer video recording system, years before Betamax or VHS existed. The system came built into cartridge television sets manufactured by companies like Admiral and Packard Bell. You could record TV programs, rent pre-recorded movies, and play them back whenever you wanted. Time-shifting television, home movies, rental entertainment, all in 1972. The technology worked. The concept was genuinely brilliant, visionary even, but the execution was catastrophic on every level. Cartravision cartridges were massive, bulky, and fragile. The recording mechanism was complex and prone to failure. The system used tape that moved incredibly slowly to save space and reduce costs, which meant tapes jammed constantly. Picture quality was mediocre at best, grainy, unstable, prone to dropouts and tracking errors. The image wavered and distorted. Colors bled. But the real killer was the rental system, an idea so poorly implemented it became insulting. Cartravision partnered with retailers to rent pre-recorded movies in special red cartridges that locked after one use. You couldn't rewind them. Once you watched, the cartridge was mechanically dead until a technician unlocked it at the rental store. The concept of rental media was genuinely ahead of its time, predicting Blockbuster by a decade. But the implementation was user-hostile and impractical. Consumers hated it. The locked cartridges felt like being treated as criminals, like the company assumed you'd cheat them. Worse, the entire system was unreliable. Machines broke down within months of purchase. The tape transport mechanisms failed, motors burned out, circuit boards overheated. The company went bankrupt in 1973, just 1 year after launch, collapsing spectacularly. Consumers who bought Cartravision sets were left with expensive television consoles and completely useless VCRs. No support, no repairs, no replacement parts, no tapes available anywhere. Cartravision proved that revolutionary ideas fail without reliable implementation. Sony's U-Matic was a technological triumph and a commercial failure. Released in 1971, it was the first video cassette recorder to use a self-contained cassette instead of cumbersome reel-to-reel tape. The engineering was brilliant. The U-matic was reliable, durable, and produced excellent video quality for its time. Sony aimed it squarely at the consumer market, imagining families recording television programs, capturing home movies, and building personal video libraries. The company genuinely believed U-matic would revolutionize home entertainment, creating an entirely new category of consumer electronics. But Sony miscalculated everything about the consumer market. The U-matic system was enormous. The cassettes were the size of hardcover books, bulky, heavy, and awkward to store. The recorder itself weighed over 40 pounds and cost over $1,400, equivalent to more than $10,000 today. Operating it required technical knowledge most consumers didn't possess. The controls were industrial, designed for professional operators, not casual home users. The tapes were expensive, about $30 each, making a small video library prohibitively costly. Recording time was limited to just 60 minutes, barely enough for a feature film, requiring tape changes mid-movie. Most devastating, the system offered no playback-only option, so consumers couldn't simply watch pre-recorded content without buying the full expensive recorder. There was no path to gradual adoption, no entry-level product. Consumers stayed away in droves. Sony's projected home video revolution never materialized. Sales were disastrous. Retailers returned unsold inventory. The consumer market Sony envisioned simply didn't exist at that price point and complexity level, but failure created an unexpected success. Television stations, schools, universities, corporations, and video production houses discovered U-matic was perfect for professional use. Sony looked at the cassette tape and thought it could be better. The L cassette, launched in 1976, was Sony's ambitious attempt to create a higher fidelity cassette format for the audiophile market. Standard compact cassettes were small and convenient, but had mediocre sound quality that serious listeners tolerated rather than celebrated. L-cassette cassettes were significantly larger, about the size of a VHS tape, with wider tape running at higher speed. The result was dramatically better sound quality, approaching reel-to-reel performance in a more convenient cassette format. Audio engineers loved it. Audiophiles were genuinely impressed by the measurable improvements. The technology was legitimate and demonstrable. Sony partnered with Panasonic and Teak to support the format, creating a coalition of respected audio manufacturers. Together, they believed they could replace standard cassettes with something technically superior, elevating home audio quality across the industry. But consumers didn't care. Cassettes weren't chosen for quality, they were chosen for convenience, portability, and ubiquity. They fit in pockets, shirt pockets, purses, car players, and portable devices. El Cassette was too big for portability, too expensive for casual use, and not quite good enough to replace high-end reel-to-reel systems that audiophiles already owned. It sat in an awkward middle ground nobody wanted. Too large for convenience, too limited for serious audiophiles. Worse, the format launched just as standard cassette technology was improving rapidly. Dolby noise reduction systems dramatically reduced tape hiss. Better tape formulations like chromium dioxide and metal particle tapes improved frequency response and dynamic range. High-quality cassette decks with three-head designs closed the quality gap significantly. The advantages of L-cassette shrank month by month, while its disadvantages, size, cost, incompatibility, remained constant. The Microvision was the world's first handheld gaming console with interchangeable cartridges. Released by Milton Bradley in 1979, it was genuinely revolutionary. Before Game Boy, before everything, you could play games anywhere, on the bus, in the car, waiting in line. Each cartridge contained not just the game, but its own processor, making the system flexible and programmable. The screen was a 16 pixel LCD matrix, primitive but functional. Games included Blockbuster, bowling, Connect 4, and pinball. The concept was visionary, years ahead of its time. For a brief moment, the Microvision seemed poised to create a new category of gaming, but the execution was catastrophic. The LCD screen was fragile and prone to screen rot, a permanent degradation where pixels died and couldn't be revived. Units failed within months. The paddle controller was uncomfortable and unresponsive, making gameplay frustrating. The screen's low resolution meant games were visually indistinct blobs moving around. Battery life was abysmal. The system drained batteries in hours. Worse, the cartridges themselves were unreliable. The exposed circuit boards corroded easily. Contacts bent or broke. Games crashed or froze constantly. Only 13 games were ever released. A pathetically small library. Third-party developers didn't support the platform. Retailers quickly lost interest as returns piled up. The build quality was so poor that surviving units are rare today. Most simply fell apart or stopped working. Milton Bradley tried to salvage the brand with a redesigned Microvision 2, but it was too late. By 1981, production ceased. The company lost millions. The handheld gaming market Milton Bradley tried to create wouldn't materialize for nearly another decade when Nintendo released the Game Boy. The Microvision proved that being first doesn't guarantee success. It often means becoming a cautionary tale. The technology wasn't ready. Consumers weren't ready. The market wasn't ready. What should have been a gaming revolution became a forgotten experiment, a prototype for a future that wouldn't arrive until better screens, better batteries, and better engineering converged. The Microvision died so the Game Boy could live. Every failed Microvision screen taught the industry what not to do. Sometimes failure's greatest contribution is showing the path forward by illuminating every dead end. The RCA Studio 2 might be the most misguided game console ever released. Launched in 1977, the same year the Atari VCS hit stores, the Studio 2 was obsolete on arrival. RCA was a giant in electronics, televisions, radios, records, but they fundamentally misunderstood gaming. The console connected directly to your TV and played games on built-in cartridges. Sounds reasonable, but the Studio 2 displayed everything in black and white, not color, black and white, in 1977, when color TVs were standard, when competitors offered vibrant color graphics. RCA chose monochrome to save costs, assuming consumers wouldn't care. They were catastrophically wrong. The graphics were primitive even by 1977 standards, blocky, crude, visually unappealing. Games included simple arithmetic programs, basic blackjack, and rudimentary pattern games that felt more like educational software than entertainment. There was no sound. None. Games played in complete silence, with only the visual feedback of white blocks moving on black screens. The controllers were built into the console itself, 2 keypads on top of the unit, meaning 2 players had to sit side by side hunched over the console. No comfort, no freedom of movement. It was ergonomic madness. The game library was microscopically small and uninspired. RCA released fewer than 10 cartridges, most of which were variations of the same basic gameplay. Third-party developers never touched the platform. Retailers barely stocked it. Reviews were scathing. The few consumers who bought the Studio 2 returned it in droves. Cube was supposed to revolutionize television. Launched in Columbus, Ohio in 1977 by Warner Cable, it was the world's first interactive cable system. Subscribers received a set-top box with buttons that let them respond to programming in real time. You could vote on game show questions, participate in community polls, choose camera angles during sports broadcasts, order products during shopping programs, and even take college courses from home. Cube offered 30 channels, an unheard-of number in the 1970s, including 10 community access channels. The technology worked. The interactivity was genuine. For a moment, it felt like science fiction becoming reality. QB attracted national media attention. Warner expanded to other cities, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Houston, Dallas. Futurists predicted interactive TV would transform democracy, education, and commerce. But QUB had fundamental problems. The interactive technology was expensive to install and maintain. The set-top boxes were complex and broke frequently. Programming that utilized interactivity was expensive to produce and didn't attract audiences large enough to justify costs. Most subscribers used QB exactly like regular cable, ignoring the interactive features entirely. Worse, privacy concerns emerged. QB tracked viewer responses and preferences, creating detailed profiles of subscriber behavior. Critics warned about surveillance capitalism before the term existed. People felt uncomfortable knowing Warner knew what they watched, when they watched, and how they responded. The backlash was significant. Then came the financial reality. Interactive programming didn't generate revenue. Advertisers weren't willing to pay premiums. Subscribers weren't willing to pay higher fees. The technology cost far more to operate than traditional cable. By the early 1980s, Warner was losing money on every Cube system. The company quietly began removing interactive features, converting Cube into standard cable service. By 1984, true interactivity was gone. Cube became just another cable provider with a meaningless name. Warner Cable eventually merged with other companies, and Cube disappeared entirely. The dream of interactive television died for 2 decades until the Internet made it possible properly. Before RCA's disastrous CED video disc system, there was something even stranger: holotape. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, RCA developed a holographic video recording system that seemed like pure science fiction. Holotape used photographic film inside cartridges, recording video information as microscopic holographic patterns. Lasers would read the patterns and reconstruct the video image. The concept was breathtaking, potentially higher quality than any magnetic system, immune to degradation, and using technology that felt decades ahead of its time. RCA poured millions into research, building prototypes, demonstrating systems to investors and press. Patents were filed, promotional materials were printed. Trade show demonstrations left audiences stunned. RCA believed holotape would leapfrog all competing video formats and dominate the home video market they were certain was coming. But holotape never escaped the laboratory. The technical challenges were insurmountable with 1970s technology. The holographic film was extraordinarily expensive to manufacture. Recording video onto holographic film required equipment so complex and costly that consumer production was impossible. Playback systems were unreliable, lasers misaligned, images distorted, mechanisms jammed. The cartridges themselves were fragile and sensitive to temperature and humidity. Even in controlled laboratory conditions, holotape barely worked. In real-world consumer environments, it would have been a catastrophe. Worse, magnetic tape systems like VHS and Betamax were improving rapidly, offering good enough quality at fraction of the cost. By the mid-1970s, RCA quietly shelved holotape, redirecting resources to the CED system, which itself would become a legendary failure. Holotape never reached consumers. The technology was canceled before commercialization. Kodak looked at Polaroid's instant camera empire and wanted in. For decades, Polaroid owned instant photography through aggressive patents and technological innovation. Kodak, the giant of film photography, was locked out. But in 1976, Kodak decided to compete anyway, launching their own instant camera system. The cameras were sleek, well-designed, and competitively priced. The film produced quality images comparable to Polaroid's. Kodak's brand recognition and distribution network were unmatched. For a moment, it seemed like Kodak might actually break Polaroid's monopoly. Consumers responded positively. Sales were strong. Retailers stocked Kodak Instant products prominently. The instant camera market suddenly had real competition. But Polaroid wasn't going to let their empire crumble without a fight. In 1976, just months after Kodak's launch, Polaroid filed a massive patent infringement lawsuit claiming Kodak had copied their proprietary technology. The legal battle lasted 14 years. 14 years of litigation, appeals, technical testimony, and brutal courtroom warfare. In 1990, the court ruled decisively against Kodak. The company had violated multiple Polaroid patents. The instant camera system had to be discontinued immediately. Kodak was forced to recall products, compensate customers, and pay Polaroid nearly $1 billion in damages, one of the largest patent settlements in history. But the financial damage was only part of the catastrophe. Kodak had invested billions developing, manufacturing, and marketing instant cameras. Factories had been built, supply chains established, marketing campaigns launched. Suddenly, all of it was worthless. Consumers who bought Kodak instant cameras were left with devices that couldn't get film. Kodak offered refunds and exchanges, but the brand damage was severe. The company looked incompetent. How had they launched a major product line without securing patent rights? The instant camera disaster contributed to Kodak's long decline. The company wasted resources and focus on a doomed product while digital photography, technology Kodak actually invented, emerged to disrupt the entire industry. The TV typewriter was beautifully insane, a $120 kit that turned your television into a computer terminal. Released in 1973 by Radio Electronics magazine designer Don Lancaster, it was one of the first affordable ways for hobbyists to display text on a TV screen. You built it yourself from components: circuit boards, chips, resistors, capacitors. The kit came with instructions, schematics, and the promise of technological independence. When assembled correctly, the TV typewriter could display 16 lines of 32 characters on a standard television. You could type messages, create simple programs, experiment with digital displays. For electronics enthusiasts and early computer hobbyists, it was revolutionary. The TV typewriter inspired a generation of hackers and became part of the origin story of personal computing. But as a consumer product, it was a disaster. The kit required advanced electronics knowledge to assemble. Soldering hundreds of components without errors was beyond most people's skill. Instructions were technical and assumed expertise most buyers didn't have. One mistake, a reversed component, a cold solder joint, a misplaced wire, and the entire system wouldn't work. Troubleshooting was nearly impossible without oscilloscopes and advanced diagnostic tools. The TV typewriter didn't connect to anything. It wasn't a computer, it was just a display. You couldn't save data. You couldn't run programs. You couldn't interface with storage or input devices without building additional complex circuits. It was a technological dead end, an experiment that led nowhere practical. Worse, the character quality was terrible, blocky, barely readable, prone to interference and distortion. The novelty wore off fast. After spending dozens of hours building the kit, Users realized they'd created an expensive, limited device with no practical application. The TV typewriter couldn't replace a typewriter. It couldn't function as a computer. It was a toy for people who enjoyed building electronics more than using them. Pulsar had already shocked the world with the first LED digital watch in 1972. By 1975, they attempted something even more ambitious, the Pulsar calculator watch, a wristwatch with a full calculator built in. It was technological jewelry, a statement piece that screamed, "I live in the future." The watch had a tiny keyboard on the face with buttons for numbers and basic math operations. You could add, subtract, multiply, and divide on your wrist. The LED display showed calculations in glowing red numbers. For business professionals, engineers, and tech enthusiasts, it was irresistible. The calculator watch cost around $500, nearly $3,000 in today's money, making it a luxury item for early adopters. The technology worked, and for a brief moment, calculator watches seemed like the next evolution of wearable tech. But the Pulsar calculator watch was fundamentally flawed. The buttons were microscopically small, almost impossible to press accurately. Trying to input numbers required a fingernail or stylus, making quick calculations frustrating. The LED display drained battery power so aggressively that the watch died within days of normal use. You couldn't keep the display on continuously. You had to press a button to illuminate it, meaning you couldn't glance at the time naturally. Worse, the calculator function was nearly useless in practice. Performing calculations on your wrist required awkward arm positions and intense concentration. It was faster and easier to just use a pocket calculator, which everyone already carried. The watch was thick, heavy, and uncomfortable, more like wearing a small computer than a timepiece. The novelty wore off almost immediately. Within months, cheaper calculator watches flooded the market from companies like Casio and Texas Instruments, selling for $50 or less. These weren't better watches, but they were good enough and affordable. Pulsar's premium positioning collapsed. The calculator watch went from exclusive future tech to cheap gimmick in less than 2 years. By the late 1970s, calculator watches were everywhere and worthless. Gas station giveaways, children's toys, junk drawer clutter. Pulsar's brand prestige evaporated. The company that had pioneered digital watches was now just another manufacturer in an oversaturated market. The calculator watch taught the industry that combining technologies doesn't create value unless the combination solves a real problem. Wearing a calculator on your wrist wasn't better than carrying one in your pocket. It was worse in almost every way. The Pulsar calculator watch became a symbol of technology for technology's sake, innovation without purpose. The Xerox Alto is one of computing's greatest tragedies, a revolutionary computer that changed everything and sold almost nothing. Developed at Xerox PARC in 1973, the Alto was decades ahead of its time, a machine so advanced it looked like it had arrived from the future. It featured a graphical user interface with windows, icons, and a mouse, concepts that wouldn't become mainstream for another decade. It had Ethernet networking, connecting multiple computers years before networking became standard. It pioneered laser printing technology. It offered a bitmapped display showing exactly what would print. WYSIWYG, before the acronym existed, before anyone thought documents on screen should match printed output. The Alto was the template for every modern computer interface, the blueprint that defined how humans would interact with computers for the next 50 years. Steve Jobs famously visited Xerox PARC in 1979, saw the Alto, and walked out with concepts he'd used to create the Macintosh. Bill Gates saw it and built Windows. The entire modern computing industry was birthed in that laboratory. But the Alto itself never reached consumers. Xerox built approximately 2,000 units, used primarily internally at Xerox facilities and distributed to select universities and research institutions. The company understood intellectually they had something revolutionary, but couldn't figure out how to commercialize it. The Alto was expensive, estimated around $40,000 per unit if mass-produced, equivalent to nearly $200,000 today. But cost wasn't the real barrier. Xerox was fundamentally a copier company. Their entire corporate identity, sales infrastructure, and distribution network existed to sell photocopiers and office equipment to purchasing managers and corporate procurement departments. Their salespeople didn't speak the language of computing. Management couldn't conceptualize the personal computer market that didn't yet exist. They saw computers as business tools for corporations, not consumer products for homes. Multiple attempts to create commercial consumer versions of the Alto failed spectacularly. The Xerox Star, released in 1981 as the Alto's official commercial successor, cost $16,595, absurdly, prohibitively expensive. It was beautiful, sophisticated, and commercially irrelevant. The Star sold fewer than 25,000 units before being discontinued as a failure. By then, the Apple II was dominating the home computer market at a fraction of the price, and IBM had entered with the PC, legitimizing personal computing for businesses. Xerox had pioneered graphical computing and then stood helplessly by while Apple, Microsoft, and others built billion-dollar empires on concepts Xerox invented but couldn't successfully market. The tragedy isn't that the Alto failed, it's that Xerox couldn't translate revolutionary research into commercial success despite having everything required. The company had the technology, the resources, the talent, the patents, and a multi-year head start. What they lacked was vision beyond their core business. Xerox executives saw computers as productivity tools for offices, not transformative devices for individuals. They couldn't imagine a world where everyone owned a personal computer, where computing would become personal, ubiquitous, essential. In the 1970s, several companies tried to convince consumers they needed computerized home weather stations. These weren't simple thermometers. They were complex systems with outdoor sensors, indoor displays, and primitive microprocessors that calculated forecasts based on barometric pressure, temperature, and humidity trends. Brands like Heathkit, Radio Shack, and others marketed these systems as essential home technology, the next must-have gadget for the modern household. Advertisements showed families in perfectly styled living rooms checking their personal weather computers before planning weekends, as if backyard sensors were somehow more reliable than professional meteorologists with satellite data, radar networks, and decades of training. The marketing suggested that serious homeowners needed their own meteorological equipment, that relying on television weather reports was primitive and unreliable. The weather stations were expensive, typically $200 to $500, serious money in the 1970s, equivalent to $200 to $3,000 today. Installation required mounting outdoor sensors properly on poles or rooftops, running cables through walls and windows, calibrating equipment with precision instruments, and maintaining batteries that powered remote sensors. The systems promised accurate hyperlocal forecasts, historical data tracking, trend analysis, and scientific precision that would make you the meteorologist of your own microclimate. For weather enthusiasts and electronics hobbyists, they were genuinely fascinating. Real scientific instruments generating real data. For everyone else, they were expensive solutions to problems that didn't exist. The fatal flaw was obvious within weeks of ownership. The weather forecasts were terrible. Consumer-grade sensors weren't sophisticated enough for reliable predictions. Barometric pressure trends can indicate weather changes, but not with the accuracy these systems boldly promised. The forecasts were frequently wrong, sometimes laughably, embarrassingly so. Users would check their expensive weather computer in the morning, see confident predictions of sunshine, then watch rain pour down outside an hour later. Why spend hundreds of dollars for worse information than the free, professionally produced weather report on TV or radio delivered by actual meteorologists? Worse, the outdoor sensors required constant, frustrating maintenance. Batteries died at inconvenient times. Cables corroded in humidity and rain. Sensors drifted out of calibration, requiring recalibration procedures most users didn't understand. Wind and rain physically damaged mounting equipment. Winter weather froze mechanical mechanisms. Ice buildup blocked sensors. Keeping the system functioning was an ongoing project that demanded time and attention most people didn't want to give. The data displays were primitive, small LED readouts or analog meters that showed numbers but provided little useful context. The 1970s saw rising crime rates and growing suburban anxiety, creating what seemed like a perfect market for home security technology. Evening news broadcasts filled living rooms with stories of break-ins, vandalism, and violent crime. Suburban families that had once left doors unlocked now installed deadbolts and peered nervously through curtains. Electronic companies sensed opportunity and rushed to sell computerized home security consoles, expensive systems with door sensors, window contacts, motion detectors, and central control panels that promised to protect families from burglars. These weren't simple alarms. They were complex electronic systems marketed as home defense computers, technological shields against the chaos of modern life. Brands like Honeywell, GE, and various ambitious startups sold systems costing $500 to $2,000, targeting middle-class homeowners terrified by news reports and hungry for solutions. The consoles featured impressive-looking control panels with flashing lights, numeric keypads, zone indicators, and status displays that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Installation required running wires through walls, drilling through door frames, mounting sensors on every entry point, and programming the central system. Labor-intensive, disruptive, and expensive. Professional installation added hundreds more to the total cost. The marketing played shamelessly on fear. Without electronic security, your family was vulnerable, exposed, defenseless against criminals prowling the streets. But the systems had catastrophic problems that revealed themselves immediately. False alarms were constant and maddening. Pets triggered motion sensors, sending families into panic. Windows expanded in summer heat, setting off magnetic contacts. Electrical interference from appliances caused random activations. Families were jolted awake by screaming alarms multiple times per week, hearts pounding, adrenaline surging, calling police in terror, only to discover nothing. A cat, a loose wire, a ghost in the machine. Police departments became overwhelmed with false alarm calls, wasting resources responding to security system malfunctions. Officers grew cynical, assuming every alarm was false, which defeated the entire purpose. Many cities began imposing fines for excessive false alarms, punishing homeowners for their malfunctioning technology. The systems were also unreliable in ways that actually mattered for security. Burglars quickly learned to cut phone lines before breaking in, instantly disabling systems that depended on landlines to call monitoring companies. Power outages killed systems without proper battery backup, leaving homes unprotected precisely when they were most vulnerable. Complex programming meant homeowners often couldn't arm or disarm their systems correctly, accidentally triggering alarms, or worse, leaving homes completely unprotected while believing they were secure. These weren't just products that failed, they were visions of futures that never arrived. Each represented someone's belief in what tomorrow should look like. Engineers spent years developing technology. Companies invested millions in manufacturing. The 1970s were the laboratory where modern tech learned to walk. These products failed so better versions could succeed. Which of these tech disasters shocked you the most? Comment your state below and subscribe for more forgotten tech history. The future is built on the wreckage of the past, and these 25 products are the foundation we forgot existed.